The meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting number 74 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to study the question of privilege related to the member for Wellington Halton Hills and other members. We have with us today Michael Chong, MP Wellington Halton Hills. Mr. Chong, you will have up to 10 minutes for an opening statement, after which we will proceed to questions from committee members. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for inviting me to appear tonight. The last several weeks have been a trying time for me and my family, but it is important to note that my case is but only one of many Canadians who have been threatened on Canadian soil by authoritarian governments and who have suffered in silence. It is my hope that real change will result from what has happened, change that will strengthen our national security and intelligence to better protect all Canadians and Canadian institutions. Here's a brief outline of the facts concerning my case. I first became aware that Mr. Wei Zhou, a PRC consular official, was collecting information on my family in the PRC from his post in Toronto in a Globe and Mail report of May 1st, 2023. The report indicated Mr. Zhou was collecting this information for further potential sanctions to put pressure on me and other MPs with respect to debates going on in the House of Commons. A national security source had previously described Mr. Zhou as a suspected intelligence actor in a Globe report of February 13th, 2023. 2 years prior, on June 24th, 2021, I was briefed by CSIS on foreign interference threat activities. This briefing was general in nature and did not contain any information about Mr. Zhou. Between that first briefing I received from CSIS on June 24th, 2021 and May 1st, 2023, no one ever informed me that Mr. Zhou was collecting information on my family from his posting here in Canada. I recommend, Madam Chair, that Mr. Wei Zhou be censured by the House for his foreign interference threat activities targeting a Canadian Member of Parliament. This would send a clear message to any person in Canada that would engage in these activities that Parliament will take action to defend its members. Clearly, Mr. Zhou and representatives of the PRC in Canada have been coercively and corruptly targeting MPs on both sides of the aisle to put pressure on MPs with respect to foreign policy. In order to identify where the systemic problems are, I recommend the committee obtain the documents and tracking records related to the July 20th, 2021 CSIS Intelligence Assessment titled People's Republic of China Foreign Interference in Canada, a Critical National Security Threat. I understand, Madam Chair, from earlier testimony that an MOU has been entered into whereby CSIS notifies the House of Commons if a member might be under threat by a foreign government. In light of this MOU, I recommend that CSIS informs an individual MP directly about specific, detailed foreign interference threat activities targeting them and their family, including the identity of persons involved in those threat activities. I also recommend that CSIS informs the Speaker of the identity of any persons in Canada involved in foreign interference threat activities targeting MPs and their families, so that the Speaker can inform all members of the House of Commons of the identity of these persons. CSIS has consistently advised that sunlight and transparency is a tool Canada can use to combat foreign interference threat activities, so that the details of these threat activities are made public. That way, MPs, citizens, parties, and candidates can make informed decisions about what is going on. A similar protocol is in place in the UK House of Commons and appears to have been used at least twice in the last couple of years. Last year, MI5 informed the UK Speaker of Ms. Christine Lee, an agent of the PRC who was engaged in foreign interference threat activities. The Speaker subsequently notified all MPs via email about this individual. In another example, all British MPs were alerted via email 2 years ago by the Speaker about two individuals acting as agents of the Russian Federation. Madam Chair, I want to say something about the unauthorized releases of intelligence. These releases are injurious to national security and diminish the confidence Five Eyes allies have in the security of Canada's intelligence. These releases would not be happening in a system that is functioning properly. And that is the responsibility of the head of government, who alone is responsible for the machinery of government. These releases are a result of a government that does not release information in a controlled and timely manner to Parliament or its committees. These releases are a symptom of a national security and intelligence system that is not working, a system that is not conveying information to Parliament, its committees, its members, to political parties, or to other individuals and institutions in a controlled and timely manner. In this day and age, information is ubiquitous and voluminous. Information is going to get out. The question is whether information is released in a timely and controlled manner by the government, or it gets released as it has been released over the last several months. It is the job of the government to provide Parliament with information in a controlled and timely manner about national security and intelligence issues, whether on the issue in front of this committee tonight, or on issues like the national security breaches at the government's Winnipeg lab. The matter in front of the committee would likely not have happened if the government had followed the example of peer jurisdictions, like the United Kingdom and the United States, that have a long history of briefing legislators on highly sensitive national security and intelligence issues. This is common practice in both countries and has been for decades. History shows that legislators are responsible and effective in how such information is shared and used. Canada needs to catch up and emulate the best practices of peer jurisdictions to ensure that critical national security and intelligence issues do not become bottlenecked within the bureaucracy and the executive. This can be done effectively and efficiently, and based on the UK and US models, there need not be a trade-off between national security and empowering legislators in this way. The Prime Minister's NSICOP committee is not a long-term solution. It has no standing in Parliament. It is effectively a committee of the government appointed by the Prime Minister on which MPs happen to sit. The change that is needed is institutional. I recommend that NSICOP be brought within Parliament. Canada needs an independent, parliamentary national security and intelligence committee on the model of the UK and the US. I also recommend the government expeditiously introduce legislation for a foreign agents registry and commit to a public inquiry focused on PRC foreign interference threat activities. In closing, Madam Chair, Western democracies will continue to come under increased threat from foreign interference by authoritarian states. Foreign governments like the PRC and the Russian Federation will not stop trying to coercively influence our institutions to bend our actions to their interests. To think otherwise is naive. An urgent whole-of-government approach is needed for this serious long-term threat. A national security review is long overdue, and I recommend the government undertake one as soon as possible. The review must go beyond the Prime Minister and our intelligence agencies. It must involve, as an equal partner, Parliament, as the institution which is the beating heart of our democracy. The government needs to act. To not act is to make our democracy needlessly more vulnerable to the threat of foreign interference. I am confident that MPs can rise to the challenge. Let's learn from our democratic allies. Let's act now to deter future foreign interference in our democracy. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Mr. Chong, pour vos commentaires.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong, for your comments. And as usual, all comments go through the chairperson. We'll start with 6-minute rounds. We'll start with Mr. Cooper, followed by Ms. Sahota, Ms. Goudreau, and then Ms. Blaney. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours, 6 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, Mr. Chong, for appearing. We know, based upon what the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor informed you, that CSIS had provided the July 20th, 2021 intelligence assessment that revealed that you and your family in Hong Kong were a target of an accredited diplomat at Beijing's Toronto consulate, and that that memo had been sent to the Prime Minister's own department, as well as to relevant departments, including Global Affairs Canada. The Prime Minister claims that he first learned about this when it was reported in the Globe and Mail on May 1st. Do you believe that that is credible? And if the Prime Minister, in fact, is being truthful, that he did only learn of it on May 1st, what does that say about his fitness for office as the Prime Minister responsible for the machinery of government?
Well, I think it's important to clarify that the July 20th, 2021 intelligence assessment of CSIS was sent by CSIS to various points within the Government of Canada, including the Privy Council office. That is my understanding of what happened. What exact points other than the Privy Council office it went to is not clear. I think it's also important to note that if one is to take the Prime Minister at his word, then clearly there was a breakdown in the machinery of government. In the government's open and accountable government document, it's clear that the sole responsibility for the machinery of government is the Prime Minister's. It's also clear in that same foundational document that the Prime Minister is the lead on national security and has a special responsibility to national security. And so combining those two facts, that the Prime Minister has a special responsibility for national security and is alone responsible for the machinery of government, I think it's clear that the Prime Minister failed to architect the machinery of government in a way that would ensure that information flowed to MPs and to the House of Commons when those MPs and the House was under target of foreign interference threat activities.
There's no question that this was a significant failure, a major breakdown in a best-case scenario. It may be worse than that the Prime Minister knew about this and sat on it, but taking the Prime Minister at his word, who ultimately bears responsibility for this failure?
Well, I think the machinery of government is the Prime Minister's responsibility alone, and that's not just my opinion, that's a fact. Open and accountable government makes it clear that the Prime Minister alone is responsible for the machinery of government, in other words, responsible for the architecture of the government, the organizational structure of the government, and that the structure would be established in a way that would prevent MPs being targeted from being made aware of those specific threat activities is astounding. I would add that the best practice of Five Eyes Alliance allies makes it clear that other allies in the Five Eyes Alliance have long had those procedures in place. I referenced in my opening comments a procedure that's in place, a protocol that's in place between MI5 and the UK House of Commons. And I referenced two examples of how that protocol was used in the last several years to protect the integrity of the UK Parliament from threats emanating from either an agent of the PRC or two individuals acting as agents of the Russian Federation. And so clearly that should have been put in place years ago when these threats were first raised by our intelligence community.
On May 3rd, regarding the information about the threat to your family, the Prime Minister told reporters, making a categorical statement, quote, CSIS made the determination that it wasn't something that needed to be raised to a higher level because it wasn't a significant enough concern, close quote. So it wasn't just that the Prime Minister said he didn't know. He made the categorical statement that CSIS made a determination not to pass the information on. The very next day, the Prime Minister's own national security advisor contradicted the Prime Minister. In other words, what the Prime Minister said was not true. Did that give you any further confidence in the ability of this Prime Minister to do his job and keep Canadians safe from Beijing's interference?
Well, I think there was clearly a systemic breakdown in the machinery of government, and that's why I think it's really important for the committee to understand where this information went. My understanding is that CSIS does not produce intelligence products for itself. It produces intelligence products such as the intelligence assessment in question here for one of the points outside of CSIS within the Government of Canada. I believe there are 17 national security points within the Government of Canada. And so I think it's important that the committee find out through tracking records where exactly this information about me and other MPs being targeted went within the Government of Canada, where the information about Mr. Wade Joe went within the Government of Canada, so that the committee can produce a report with recommendations about how to address these systemic failures.
Do I have time? 5 seconds. Well, okay, we'll pick it up in the next round.
Thank you. Mr. Chong, I can share that I do believe the intentions of the committee are to respond back to the House on the question of privilege before the House rises. So it's something we also take seriously. Mrs. Sahota, 6 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chong, for being here today. It definitely, I think through this forum, we'll get more insight as to how we can improve our system, and I think we have similar goals. I appreciated your recommendations. Some of those recommendations are ones that, have already been undertaken. However, I know there's nuances like NSCOP becoming a standing committee and the Foreign Agents Registry is well underway. So in a way, I wish this hadn't happened to you, but perhaps it will prompt us to do even better in the years to come. However, we have had CSIS agents come before this committee and testify that this is not a new thing, even from the time of Mulrooney, that CSIS and many agencies have had a difficult time trying to get government to act and move on ways to protect our democracy and our members of parliament from interference. There have been many steps taken, and I think we can continue to improve on those. You had mentioned that you were briefed on June 24th, 2021. I believe La Presse had also stated that you were also briefed August 1st, 2021, and then February 5th, 2022, and also July 18th, 2022. Do any of these ring a bell? Is that true or untrue?
The only briefing I received on foreign interference threat activities was in June of 2021. Yeah, that's right. That's the only briefing I received on foreign interference threat activities. And that briefing, as I mentioned in my opening comments, was general in nature.
Yes. Okay, well, that's interesting.
The other meetings weren't specifically about, they weren't briefings on foreign interference threat activities.
But there were meetings with CSIS?
Yes, I've met with CSIS outside of, yes, that's correct.
But they did not have to do anything about, with any threat level to you or to your family?
None of those meetings I had with CSIS indicated any information about Mr. Wade Joe, the PRC diplomat in Toronto.
Okay, well, that's telling as well, because I know through all of the media reporting that we've seen, there is some inaccuracies or extent to elaborate sometimes and make something of a situation that it may not be true. So I'm glad we were able to clear that up. The big question on everyone's mind, obviously, when we read about the harm or the threats faced by you and your family in the Globe and Mail article, it was difficult to read, and however, it did leave a lot of us with questions because there's many members that face these types of situations. We had witnesses here from the Alliance Canada Hong Kong that gave us examples of the intimidation and threat tactics that are used by Beijing in order to intimidate organizations, activists, members of parliament. What were the exact threats that you felt or that you now perhaps know that your family faced?
So I don't want to get into specific details about threats, but let me say this, and this may explain some of the meetings that I had with CSIS outside of my June 24th, 2021 meeting. I believe I have received threats that I believe may be related to the PRC, and I'll just leave it at that. And that explains the meetings I had with CSIS outside of that June 24th, 2021 meeting.
Without getting into details of what the threat was, is there a way for you to give us a general idea of what type of threat it is so that we have a better understanding of what to be looking out for?
Sure. There was more than one threat. Some of the one of the incidences involved something that happened in the last federal election campaign. The other incidences were outside of the federal election campaign and involved threats sent to me regarding the PRC and my travel outside the country.
And what type of threats were made to your family in Hong Kong?
Well, that's that I don't know, quite simply. As with many Canadians with family in authoritarian states, I long ago deliberately made the decision not to communicate with them in order to...
Were there some type of red flags that caused you to make that decision?
Yes, there was. They were very public flags. It's when Beijing began its violation of the 50-year Sino-British Agreement between the United Kingdom and the People's Republic of China governing Hong Kong. You'll recall that around the time of 2018, 2019, Beijing started to violate that treaty and crack down on the civil and human rights of Hong Kongers. It began with an attempt to impose an extradition treaty on Hong Kong that would have allowed the PRC to extradite anybody from Hong Kong for much broader reasons that would undermine the rule of law. It subsequently led to the introduction of a draconian new national security law, the results of which we've seen in recent years. So when those actions were taken by the PRC, out of an abundance of caution, I decided to cut off communications with my family and in Hong Kong. So as a result, I don't know what's happened to them, and it's a difficult thing to do, but it's something that many Canadians have to go through who have family back in authoritarian states.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. Madame Goudreau.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and I'll continue along the same lines. How does one feel when one learns from the Globe and Mail that, we've heard about the Canada-Hong Kong alliance, where one would be afraid, wouldn't they? What happens when you learn news like this and it is confirmed afterwards? And this is a newspaper that did its due diligence. It was shocking to learn this information, that there was a diplomat on Canadian soil that had a target on my back and on that of my family, that he was using his powers and diplomatic immunity in order to obtain information about my family back in China in order to exert pressure on myself and other members of Parliament in an effort to change the course of a debate in the House of Commons. It was shocking for me. At that particular juncture, well, there's freedom of expression, isn't there, in a democracy? We're very proud of that. Has that changed since then, to your mind? No, not for me. I am 100% convinced of the fact that our principles, that are the very underpinnings of our democracy, that in our Constitution, I believe 100% in democracy, in human rights, the rule of law. These are universal principles. They are at the very heart of Canada and other democracies worldwide. So in no way will it affect my point of view in that regard. However, I feel that we now need to double down on those principles, redouble our efforts to stand up for those principles. Question, well, there is the chairperson in attendance, Mr. Chong. Many people stand up for the Uyghur. Nothing has changed in your position in regards to the Uyghur or other such matters. No, not at all.
Even more strongly that we have to stand up for these principles in the face of these threats. These principles are all that we have. At the end of the day, all our institutions, all of our laws are based on these foundational principles, a belief in freedom and human rights, a belief in democracy, and a belief in the rule of law. And not just the principles that the Canadian state is founded on, but also the principles that other Western democracies are founded upon. And, we are under pressure, clearly, not just Canada, but other democracies from authoritarian states. Freedom House has published an annual survey now for decades that shows that democracies are on their back heel and under pressure.
Moi, j'ai le souci.
I'm afraid, and sorry to cut you off, but I'm afraid for your family back here in Canada. You've cut off ties with your family in China. I'm sure that was a heavy burden, and of course you might feel free to express yourself, but what about the collateral damage? Are members of your family concerned? Have they spoken to you about their concern? Well, yes, they have somewhat. I've reassured my family that we're not in any way going to alter our principles, our standpoint, our convictions, and that we must stay the course.
What was disconcerting was to know that on St. George Street in Toronto, a diplomat was working to collect information about me. And, I live in near Toronto, and I'm often at the University of Toronto, which is just down the street, meeting with policy experts and other experts. And to know that just a mere several blocks away for several years, somebody was actively trying to collect information about me and my family in the PRC was deeply disconcerting. And to know that the Government of Canada knew about this and didn't do anything about it was deeply disappointing.
Ma dernière question.
My final question. When it comes to briefings of a general nature, if I get a briefing, do I have enough information at my disposal to clue me into the fact that I might be the victim of foreign interference? You've experienced it. You've lived it. And as we say in Quebecois, this has struck a chord. This is what's happened. The penny's dropped. Obviously, the briefing was just not enough. It didn't sound the alarm bells that it should have. Response. I believe that the onus is on the government to inform all members of Parliament about foreign interference writ large, both provincially and federally, and also inform those members of Parliament who have a direct target on their back on the part of an authoritarian state. So I think that the government needs to do both at the same time. Thank you very much.
Blaney?
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and as always, everything through the Chair. But first, I want to just thank you so much, Mr. Chong, for coming here today. I imagine it's been a very hard period of time in your life to wrestle with these realities. And I think what you said earlier about sort of living your life as a member of Parliament, as a human being, and just down the street, there's somebody that's gathering information to what intent you don't know. And so it's very hard to fight a battle you don't even know is happening. So I'm just wondering, at any time, did CSIS advise you or your family to harm or threat that could happen?
Yes, the briefing I received on June 24th, 2021 was a briefing about foreign interference threat activities. It was a briefing general in nature, but it provided very good information about the tactics and the approaches that authoritarian states like the PRC use. So it was quite helpful, and I think it's a briefing that all MPs should receive. I think it's helpful to equip MPs with as much information as possible about how these tactics work so that they are forewarned and forearmed whenever they find themselves in a situation where that might be happening. But as I said earlier, there was no specific mention that Mr. Wei Zhou in the Toronto consulate was targeting me in particular.
So that's the challenge, is again, you were told of the general battle, but not of the specific people in the battle, and so it's hard for you to address it. So I'm wondering, since this has all come up, has there been any follow-up action around keeping you and your family safe? You talked earlier about just no longer having connections with family overseas. So I'm just wondering, has there been any discussion about how that could be addressed in a more helpful way as opposed to just sort of cutting off ties?
Well, the Sergeant at Arms here of the House of Commons indicated that if I saw anything untoward, that I was to report it to him, and CSIS has made a similar offer. So those are welcome. Those are welcome invitations for us to convey any perceived threats that we might be facing. So that's I think those are good things for intelligence agencies and for the Sergeant at Arms here to undertake. My view is that, as I said in my opening, in my recommendations, that there's really two sorts of activities that have to take place to protect members. One is that members need to be briefed in general about the general tactics and nature of foreign interference threat activities. And then secondly, individual members who are being targeted, if the government comes to obtains information that an individual member and their family are being targeted, then that individual briefing with specific details about the persons involved needs to be conveyed to that particular member. So I think both of those things should happen in concert.
Which makes a lot of sense to me, because then it allows for a response and a more coordinated effort in addressing those issues. So I'm just curious, do you have a sense of how long this has been happening, where that information was being gathered, and how they were gathering that information? Did they give you any sort of understanding of if you were being wiretapped, or how were they gathering the information?
Well, what I was told by Mr. Vigneault was that Mr. Wei Zhou was indeed the diplomat involved in gathering information about me from his posting in Toronto. Beyond that, everything else I know from the reports in the Globe and Mail, which highlights the breakdown in the machinery of government that I highlighted in my opening remarks. We should not be finding these things out from the Globe and Mail if we had a properly functioning and working national security architecture that would inform members and their families about specific threat activities. And look, this is, as I pointed out, in the UK Parliament, they have protocols in place to inform members, both members at large, all 640 or so members of the House, about persons that are in general targeting the House, and they also have protocols in place to inform individual members when they are specifically being targeted. So I think these things clearly should have been put in place a while ago in Canada. Regarding your question about what else I know through the Globe reports, well, this individual, Mr. Wei Zhou, apparently came to Canada in 2018, and CSIS had a significant intelligence file on this individual already when he arrived here, some of it from the Communications Security Establishment and some of it from U.S. intelligence. The Globe also reported that Global Affairs Canada knew about this individual for 3 years and knew that this individual was targeting not just me, but other members of Parliament.
Well, and I think your point is that national security shouldn't be going through the media. So you talked about having the release of documents, and I'm just curious about, I see how important that is, but I also see how important it is that we maintain our level of national security. So I'm just wondering, when those documents are released, should it just be to the member who's impacted, or do you feel that there should be another process as well?
Well, I don't think documents necessarily need to be released to members that are being briefed about specific targets, specific individuals targeting them. I think they need to be briefed orally about who's involved so that they can equip themselves to protect themselves. I don't think it necessarily means, exchange, conveyance of documents.
Thank you. Before we enter the second round, I'll just note that at 13, the device was not working for hearing translation, but the member has jumped onto 12, so it's not a problem for now, but just letting you know for future meetings. The second round, we will start with Mr. Calkins, Mr. Berthold, suivi par Mr. Fergus, puis Madame Goudreau.
Followed by Mr. Fergus, Ms. Goudreau, Mr. Blaney. Ms. Blaney. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. First, I'd like to congratulate you on your principles for standing up despite everything that's occurred. Now, there was a vote in the House of Commons. Everything started there. You stood up to recognise the genocide of the Uyghur peoples. Your vote garnered support of all parties except for the Liberal ministers. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. Well, it's important to state these facts because what I'm going to try and understand from you today, and we've talked a lot about transmitting information, but there's been very little action on the part of the government. Despite all of this information, the government seems quite nonchalant. The SCRS, or CSIS, singled out this diplomat in 2016 and that there'd been espionage being conducted since 2020. This is a diplomat that was responsible for collecting information on you and your family. We learned from the Globe and Mail that you had a target on your back, and yet the government claims that it knew nothing of it. How do you explain the PMO's office nonchalance and that of the Prime Minister himself on an issue that affects members of Parliament, including a lot of members of the Chinese diaspora domestically? Response. Well, I believe that it's absolutely inexplicable that the government had this information at its disposal and yet didn't take any action.
And so that's why I think the committee really needs to get to the bottom of where did these CSIS intelligence products go. There are tracking records on the top secret system, which is a system separate from the Government of Canada's regular computer systems that CSIS uses to transmit intelligence products to what I believe are the 17 national security points within the Government of Canada, one of which includes Global Affairs Canada, includes the Privy Council Office, and the other various central agencies and departments. And so I think it's really important for the committee to understand where this information went within the Government of Canada so that these systemic problems can be addressed. Because if we are to take the Prime Minister at his word that he did not know of this information, nor did the Public Safety Minister, then clearly there was a breakdown. And we need to know exactly who had the information and why it didn't go to where it needed to go for action.
That brings me to 2 points. The diplomat was expelled and the Globe and Mail source therefore seemed to be quite reliable. The same source stated that CSIS has a list of deported diplomats on the basis of their foreign interference and espionage activities. So therefore other Canadians have suffered. It's all well and good to inform people, but has the government taken any action? There's been one single expulsion, no arrests. Response. I think that the government needs to use all the tools at its disposal to combat foreign interference. Expelling one single diplomat, that's just one tool. It's not enough to combat all foreign interference.
Tools that the government needs to use. We look at other democratic allies, they've been much more willing to expel diplomats of authoritarian states that are engaged in activities that are inconsistent with their diplomatic or consular status. I think recently of the fact that that Germany expelled some 20 Russian diplomats just in the last several weeks for activities that were subversive.
Mr. Chong.
I have another question, Mr. Chong. I know that you work very hard for Parliament. You referred to ministerial accountability earlier. You said the buck stops with the Prime Minister. And for the past 8 years, this notion seems to be lost on the government. So many ministers have been found guilty of violations of ethics. We know that ministers make statements and then 1 week later they change the versions of what they said. What is the place for ministerial accountability in our democratic system in Canada? Well, I believe that the buck stops with the ministers. It's their ultimate responsibility.
If you look at the open and accountable government on the government's own website, it's its foundational guiding document of the ministry. It's clear that the Prime Minister alone is responsible for the machinery of government and has a special responsibility for national security.
Merci.
Mr. Fergus, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chong. I've been following your political career for quite some time, well before I arrived in politics myself, and I know that you are a person who believes firmly in institutions.
The Globe and Mail articles, I was deeply disturbed and concerned, as I imagine, as you made clear as you were, because of the privileges which we have as members of Parliament and the role that we play, and the role that we need to be free to play. When I read some of the comments and hearing your testimony here, I could see that there are things which you are trying to protect the security services and the information that you receive, to respect your obligations as a former cabinet minister, to respect the counsel that are shared with you. But I'm trying to figure out, how do we go forward here? Are there things that you would like to share with this committee that you know that you can't share in public?
Well, the only information I don't want to share in public are the specific threats that were directed at me in the last several years that appear to be related to the PRC. So I don't want to talk specifically about those threats for obvious reasons. But yeah, that's the only information that. And I've conveyed those threats to the appropriate agencies and authorities in the federal government, and
I'm assuming
to my local police force of jurisdiction.
And I'm assuming also that those threats were shared with you from our security agencies in your most recent briefings.
Yes, the threat regarding Mr. Weijo was shared to me by Mr. David Vigneault.
Were there other...
The day after the Globe report.
Without going into details, into specifics, were there other threats that were shared with you?
Specific threats? No.
Would it, according to La Presse, from what I've read,
yes.
Vous avez reçu 4...
There were 4 interactions that you had with CSIS. And you spoke at length about your discussion on the 24th of June 2021, but there were 3 other occasions when you met with CSIS. Could you please share with members of this committee the dates of those other discussions? Well, first, is it true that there were 3 other meetings with CSIS officials? And secondly, could you please share details?
First of all, I know the June 24th date because I looked at June 24th, 2021 date because I looked it up. And I'll take as I've met with CSIS beyond that several times. But as I've said before, those other meetings with CSIS was for me to convey to CSIS specific threat activities that I believe I have been the target of. One involving the last federal election campaign, and other threat activities I believe directed at me outside of the campaign. So I don't want to get into specifics of what those threat activities were. But that was my reason for conveying to
So
CSIS
I won't
during
ask
these
you
three
to-
other meetings. Yeah.
I'll try not to get into the specifics, but maybe you can just confirm some of the dates, just because La Presse had reported it, that it sounded that CSIS had an interaction with you. So I just want to make sure that
Yeah,
the dates are...
I can't confirm that right now.
No,
I'm
but
happy to provide the
would
committee
would
with
it be
the other
helpful? So-
meetings that I had with CSIS, yes.
So I'm just going to, just for the record, just lay out those dates
Sure.
that La Presse had reported on.
Sure.
They talked about le 5 août 2020.
The 5th of August 2021.
2022.
Yep.
And then the 18th of July 2022. If you could be so kind as to share with the committee at a later time, that would be very helpful.
I'm happy to confirm whether or not those are the correct dates. And I can tell you right now why those three meetings took place. It's because after my initial meeting of June 24th, 2021, where CSIS opened up a channel of communication with me, as they did with some other 40 MPs, I believe they've briefed on the general nature of foreign interference threat activities. I was, I believe, subject to some foreign interference threat activities, and so I conveyed those threats to CSIS. And like I said earlier, I don't want to get into the details of what those threats were, but that was the reason for the three other meetings, and I will get back to the committee on those, on whether or not those were the actual 3 dates.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. Mr. Chong, just for my understanding, would you prefer having some time in camera that is not in public?
I prefer not to reveal the nature of those threats.
Whether in camera or in public?
That's right.
Okay. Just want to ask. Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Goudreau. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Well, listen, I won't hide the fact that since November, Mr. Chong, we've been dealing with Chinese interference. There have been a number of polls conducted. 1 out of every 5 Canadians, for example, have more or less confidence in the results of elections. And since then, the PROC committee has had its work cut out for it. And now we're learning, like, for example, today, and I'd like your comments on this, that Minister Mendicino has issued a new directive for CSIS. It's been a one-way street till now, but requiring the agency to inform the government of all and every threats to elected officials, members of parliaments, to the extent possible. Now, we've been calling for action for 50 times, that the government needs to be bold. And yet these are tiny baby steps. I'd like you to elaborate on this. Unfortunately, you are playing a key role in ensuring that our democracy and its tenets are upheld. Response. Well, I think it's far overdue. It's too late, this directive from Minister Mendicino. It's glaringly obvious that there's a huge threat on the horizon when it comes to foreign interference. And obviously Canada isn't the only target. Other democracies worldwide are too. It's high time that the government puts in place other tools to combat foreign interference.
To have the government needs to introduce expeditiously a foreign agents registry, legislation for a foreign agents registry. We need to reconcile the problematic definitions of foreign interference in the Security of Information Act and in the CSIS Act that are different from each other. We need to reconcile the security community's definition of foreign interference with the RCMP's differing definition. We need to ensure that the RCMP has the resources it needs to prosecute not just foreign interference, but espionage, as we recently seen with the Hydro-Quebec case and the recently botched case, I might add, of a former agriculture employee of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in the prairies. So there's a whole range of things that need to have been done yesterday to protect us from foreign interference and espionage.
Merci. Madame Blaney.
So I just need this clarified. It's pretty much a yes/no. So the meetings that were just offered to you, you asked for those meetings.
That is correct.
Thank you. I just wanted that
Yeah,
clearly
so
on the record.
I did not ask for the meeting of June 24th.
Yes.
This was part of CSIS's effort to reach out to MPs, to brief them on the general nature of foreign interference threat activities. I believe our colleague, MP Jenny Kwan, also received a briefing, and I think dozens of MPs subsequently received a briefing on that. The subsequent 3 meetings, which I will double-check the dates on, of August 5th, 2021, February 5th, 2022, and July 18th, 2022, were me reaching out to CSIS to convey information that I had about threat activities that I think I was the target of.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So, you know, we've heard testimony from other folks that have had challenges with authoritarian governments and states. And they have talked about going to the local police or RCMP to try to say this is happening and getting absolutely no response. And so there seems to be a lack of awareness or understanding at that level of how to address that issue, which I think all fits in, because you've talked about how you've also shared with local RCMP what's happening. So I guess my question really is, what sort of protective measures need to be put in place for MPs? We have this extra bit of privilege. If something gets caught, it goes in the Globe and Mail. But for so many Canadians who are not in these roles, nobody's going to report on that. So what do you think we need to do around addressing this in a more meaningful way, comprehensively across Canada, both on the political level but on the everyday level of people in Canada?
Well, first, as has long been called for by experts in the intelligence community, we need to reconcile the different definitions in the Security of Information Act and the CSIS Act on the definition of foreign interference. I think the next thing that needs to happen is that there has to be a clear understanding between our intelligence community that collects intelligence, which may be converted into evidence, and the RCMP about the definition of foreign interference, so that investigations can be begun and prosecutions can follow. To my knowledge, in the last several years, despite the heightened foreign interference threat activities here in Canada, we've not had a single investigation that's led to a prosecution of any agent acting on behalf of an authoritarian state here in Canada, despite the fact that in our closest allies, individuals have been arrested for these activities.
Thank you. Mr. Chong, as you're not a stranger to these hallways and these meetings, we will just be taking you slightly over the hour just to finish this round, if that's okay. Thank you for indulging us. Mr. Calkins, followed by Mr. Turnbull.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my questions for my colleague, Mr. Chong, will go through you, of course, but I'd just like to start off by thanking my colleague. He and I have been here a long time. If you add the years together, I think it works out to something like 36 years of service in this place. And I have known him a long time, and I want to commend him for the grace that he has comported himself with since finding this information out, and I wish him and his family the best going forward, regardless of what comes out of these meetings. Mr. Chong, you're no doubt aware that this committee has been seized with undertaking a study on foreign interference as it pertains to elections, in which case we've seen numerous pieces of information be put into the public realm through the non-normal channels that we would normally expect to see through transparency and sunlight. And I have my own thoughts about whether or not it's the machinery of government that's a breakdown, or whether it's a political vacuum in leadership. But we've asked numerous times in this committee for the production of documents through various motions. Some of the motions have passed, some of the motions were amended to remove the production of documents. There is a motion before this committee right now that will request documents. And I guess my question for you is, given the fact that the information will be largely about you, for an example, do you think it's completely reasonable in a production of documents request that that this committee should not only adopt that production of documents, but is it reasonable that both unredacted and redacted copies be sent to the parliamentary law clerk so that the law clerk can then discern between and compare and contrast between the redacted documents, which we have seen some of, which aren't particularly helpful, but the unredacted documents at the discretion of the law clerk being able to make that information available to this committee so that we may come up with proper findings and recommendations so that this committee, in looking at this this question of privilege on your behalf, can come up with the best recommendations.
Well, thank you. I think that's exactly the procedure that should be undertaken. Parliament has the unfettered right to call for the production of documents and witnesses. I remember when a witness had to be released from the custody of Her Majesty and Right of the Province of Ontario from, I believe, the Mimico Correctional Facility, one Karl-Heinz Schreiber, because the Speaker had ordered this individual to appear, had issued a warrant, I believe, for this individual to appear in front of a committee. So Parliament has always had the unfettered right to call for the production of documents and individuals, and I think in this case, I think the government should provide documents under lock and key to the parliamentary law clerk, who would then make the decision about redactions in consultation with government officials about anything that would be injurious to national security in order to protect national security. And I think that's an appropriate process to follow. I think if NSICOP were ever to be brought into Parliament, it would be a good procedure for Parliament to follow. It's one that was recommended by the previous law clerk Duchesne. And I think it's a good process to follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. My next question is more of a question about your opinion and feelings about the whole matter at hand. As members of Parliament, we hear from our constituents all the time. Sometimes we hear things that appear to be horror stories. I've had people come to me saying that they've been under threat. I do not have a large Chinese-Canadian diaspora in my constituency, but I have some. And some of them are very reluctant to talk to me over the phone. They're very reluctant to send me an email. And it's usually, they're trying to find ways to talk to me without anybody knowing that we're talking. And I found that odd when it was first happening. And the brazenness of trying to intimidate a sitting elected MP in the House of Commons of Canada tells me that there is no fear by the PRC. What can you tell us about if they're willing to do this to you, what are they willing to do to a Chinese-Canadian citizen for intimidation?
Thank you. I think that's the real thing we need to be focused on. It's not just my case. It's the fact that behind my case, there are many Canadians, it's hard to quantify, that have suffered in silence for years. We've heard stories about people in tears who've been targeted by authoritarian states, and for too long, the government hasn't taken action to defend them here on Canadian soil. Look, we don't have any jurisdiction outside of Canada to enforce Canadian law outside of Canada, but surely we can do a good job here in defending Canadians here on Canadian soil who are being targeted here at home by agents acting on behalf of authoritarian states. Now, Madam Chair, if I could just indulge you, I have confirmed that I met, in addition to the June 24th, 2021 meeting, which CSIS reached out to me to have. That was the meeting of the general nature of foreign interference threat activities. I can confirm that I reached out to CSIS 3 other times to convey to them information about threat activities that I believe were being targeted at me by the PRC. And the meetings were on August 5th, 2021, February 25th, 2022, and July 18th, 2022.
Thank you, Mr. Chong, for providing that insight. And I will just note that oftentimes I give Mr. Calkins 4 minutes instead of 5, and today he got 6 minutes and 39 seconds. With that, we will. He's way ahead of the game. That's a minute 39 extra. I'll work on better as always possible. Mr. Turnbull, 5 minutes to you.
I'm hoping that I'm afforded the same generosity of the chair with time. But Mr. Chong, I wanted to say thanks for being here tonight. I appreciate your testimony. I note that you've been around Parliament Hill and serving for quite some time, I think about 19 years if I'm not mistaken. So thank you for your service. As this session tonight will form part of our study on foreign interference, which we've been studying for some time, I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you a little bit more about foreign interference in the Harper government, which you obviously served in. We haven't had a lot of opportunity to hear from officials or representatives from that period, with the exception of Ms. Byrne, who we were happy to hear from recently. Last week, she said she was never briefed on the potential of foreign interference. She also said she never received any reports and there were no briefings by CSIS. She also went on to say that foreign interference never came to mind. Essentially, it wasn't a major concern at the time. Would you agree with that?
I recall that former CSIS director Dick Fadden publicly raising concerns about certain politicians, certain elected officials in Canada at the provincial and municipal level that were being targeted by the PRC in Canada. And I recall that the Globe and Mail at the time, some 10 years ago, reported that a certain Liberal MPP in Ontario, that CSIS had advised the government of the day that a certain Liberal MPP in Ontario was involved.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I think what I'm hearing from you is that you acknowledge that it was a concern, that was foreign interference during the Harper era.
That's correct.
Okay, great. And so I would agree with you on that from my perspective. Going through public reports, I can count no less than 8 CSIS annual reports provided to the government and Parliament that outline foreign interference as a major concern for the agency. In fact, in 2009-2010 annual report, it states, Canada, and I quote, "Canada has also traditionally been vulnerable to foreign interference activities. Foreign powers have engaged in covertly monitoring and intimidating various communities. In many cases, these activities are designed to support the political agendas of foreign governments, a cause linked to a homeland conflict, or to unduly influence Government of Canada policies," end quote. Could you perhaps point to 1 or 2 examples from the Harper era that responded to the concerns brought forward by CSIS?
Well, thank you. I believe you are correct in saying that CSIS had identified foreign interference as a threat during the time that Prime Minister Harper was in power. If I recall correctly, CSIS was if I recall correctly, the primary foreign interference threat activity that was taking place at the time was directed at provincial governments. And if I recall correctly, the Harper government authorized CSIS to brief the governments of Premier Dalton McGuinty and Premier Kathleen Wynne on these foreign interference threat activities.
Thank you. I note that in the summer of 2010, the Public Safety and National Security Committee held a high-profile meeting to hear testimony from CSIS Director at the time, Richard Fadden. In that meeting, Mr. Fadden testified that he had information that provincial, just as you said, provincial and municipal politicians in various provinces had come under the influence of foreign interference. He also confirmed that he had briefed Prime Minister Harper's National Security Advisor and sought advice from the PCO, Privy Council Office, on how to deal with foreign interference. Mr. Harper, though, claimed that he had no knowledge of these matters. So I wondered do you think that reflects a failure of former PM Harper and the machinery of government at the time?
Well, if one were to take the Prime Minister at his word, then clearly that information should have been relayed to the Prime Minister. But I do know that action was taken on that foreign interference because it was a bit of a controversy at the time.
Okay. And today you've said that there are symptoms of these are symptoms of a system that is not working, and that these things should have been put in place a while ago. So given what you've said today about your particular case, would you have the same criticism for PM Harper and the era in terms of the breakdown of the machinery of government?
Well, that's a good question. No, I wouldn't, and here's why. I think the nature of the PRC has changed significantly in and around the time of the expiry of the first term of President Xi. Around 2017, when President Xi assumed his second term in power, it became the form and the nature of President Xi became much clearer, and it became clear that this was an authoritarian, much more authoritarian state that was using foreign interference threat activities as a way to promulgate its authoritarian model of governance around the world and to defend its interests. And so I think the era up till 2017 was a different era. And I know that because I followed this closely, and I wasn't at all concerned about things like Hong Kong prior to 2017, 2018. I wasn't concerned about Canadian journalists in the PRC prior to that point in time. And I don't think the foreign interference threat activities here on Canadian soil were nearly as intense as they have become in the last 5 years.
Madam Chair, is my time up? I'm not afforded the same generosity, or do I get another 10
It would be another
seconds?
25 seconds.
I just wanted to ask if I feel like we could spend some more time with MP Chong and hopefully get some more testimony. And I wondered if we could invite him back, perhaps in camera, to get into a bit more detail. I feel like I have additional questions. I had quite a few other questions.
I'm still 10 seconds shy, but it was a little bit of a different story, and Mr. Chong was also providing us insights when he was responding to that. Mr. Chong, would you be inclined to come back in camera if members were to ask you to come in camera?
I'm happy to appear in front of committee, but I'm happy to appear in front of committee in public.
But you would not want to come in camera? You don't feel like you can add anything to us in camera that you can't do in public?
Yeah, I think I can add. I think all the useful information to the committee I can provide in public.
But the details you don't want to provide to us. I think it's just been disturbing a little bit of what you have undergone. I think this has actually raised kind of an understanding as to what MPs do deal with. I think you have been courageous as to actually sharing that, and I know you have a young family, so it's something that I personally don't have. So I think it's just a matter of trying to get into the details of it, but it's something you prefer not to do.
Yeah, I prefer not to speak about the specific details of the threats directed at me or my family. I'm happy to mention that there have been threats, but I don't think the details of the threats are useful for the committee in its work.
Okay, and I think that's why we'll just let members actually figure out if we're inviting you back again as well, but I do appreciate you sharing with us where you do stand. Mrs. Sahota?
Madam Chair, if the committee would allow, just a quick point of clarification, because I don't know when the scheduling would happen again. Mr. Chong had said at the beginning of his recommendations that he would recommend having a public inquiry on looking into the interference by the PRC, and then later on in your testimony, you had broadened the scope a little bit. So I was just wondering if you could clarify whether you think a public inquiry should just be PRC, or whether it should be include all countries and threats to other members of Parliament.
The time is up for the Liberals. I think
I'm happy to answer the question.
Mr. Berthold, I think she's just asking if there is, just because their comment I think was made in regards to
I'm happy to answer the
members.
question.
Yes.
My experience with public inquiries is that if they are focused, they can achieve results that benefit Canadian institutions. If they are unfocused, they don't. So my view is that any public inquiry should focus exclusively on PRC foreign interference threat activities and not those of other states, in order to keep the inquiry focused.
I think that's fine answer. Are we okay? Perfect. Mr. Chong, we want to thank you for your time and attention today. We wish you the best. If there's anything else you want to add, please just send it to the clerk. We'll have it translated in both official languages and shared with all committee members. With that, we wish you the best. Thank you so much for your time today. Members, we will just suspend really quickly, and then we will switch into in-camera suspending. Thank you.